Thanks again for joining. Today on my agenda, I have a few things I want to cover. This is mostly going to be about new functionality in Forensic Email Collector that we introduced since the last webinar. So I'll go over our new provider type, Pop3, and we'll set up some batch email acquisitions to see how that works. And then we'll talk about controlling Forensic Email Collector from the command line, get into running some searches from a list of keywords with some limiting expressions, generating some search reports, and then we'll look at Google Drive attachments and some new things that are coming down the line. So I'll start by sharing my screen here so you can see Forensic Email Collector. Just a second. All right, so you should be seeing my screen with the Metaspike logo here. Let me bring this up here. All right. So the first thing that I want to do is to talk about the new Pop3 Provider. This is something that we initially thought about not including at all because Pop3 is pretty old technology. Most servers today are either using Exchange or Gmail API or their own APIs or at a minimum IMAP. But over the years, we've had quite a few requests for POP because there are still a few providers left, especially web hosting companies like GoDaddy and NetZero that either don't have IMAP capability or they have it selectively on some accounts and not all. So when that's the case, then it doesn't make a lot of sense to use a general purpose tool like Outlook or Thunderbird to do a collection like that. So you have two options. You either upgrade the account and add IMAP support to it if it's possible. That is possible with GoDaddy, or you were forced to use the tool like Outlook before. So to work around it, we've introduced POP support into FEC. So I'm going to walk through it real quick to show you how it works. Let's open Forensic Email Collector. So I'm going to try to collect a mailbox from GoDaddy here. And my account actually does have IMAP support, but I'm going to pretend that it doesn't. So I'll switch over to IMAP. So let's put in the target here. So FEC automatically picked up GoDaddy's IMAP settings. So I'm going to switch over to POP in case, or assuming that this account didn't have IMAP support. So we can go to this switch profile link here. And you see that we have 4 provider types now. You can choose POP and it'll switch to that. So let's put the IMAP POP server address for GoDaddy. And let's put in a password here. All right, so let's fill this out for the first acquisition we're doing today. I'll skip it for the rest of the day. All right, so let's say we put something like this here. Let's pick an output path. So the first thing that I should say is the POP provider that we have supports just about all the core functionality of Forensic Email Collector. So it will allow you to output in MSG and PSD formats. You can hash like we do. You can stop the acquisition and resume, or it'll automatically retry if there's a problem. But as far as limitations go, there are a few. One of them is POP doesn't support that in-place search capability that we have. So you're not going to be able to search it on the spot and instantly. The second huge difference is POP protocol doesn't have the notion of folders and flags like IMAP does. So it's going to allow you to only acquire the inbox, which is a huge limitation. So I would say, clearly this is a last resort type situation here. You don't want to use POP unless you really have to. But if there's no other option like net zero, for example, then rather than not collect anything, often it's better to collect the inbox at least. So let's pick this and proceed with the acquisition here. We're fetching the mailbox content. You'll see that this is a lot more bare bones than what you usually see here because of that exact issue I mentioned. So there's only access to inbox here and nothing about searching, which is expected. So let's proceed with the acquisition. The rest of it looks just about the same. There's one difference between POP and IMAP as far as FEC is concerned, and that is when we do POP, we don't do the batch requests to the server, whereas in IMAP we had support for that, so we could bundle the requests up and request, for example, 100 messages from the server and then let them trickle in, so that's a lot faster. In POP, we're requesting them one at a time because of protocol limitations. And you'll see that when you compare side by side FEC's performance on the same mailbox, same mail folder between POP and IMAP, you'll see that POP is a little bit slower than IMAP, but it's still pretty high performance compared to the other tools that I've seen, especially general purpose tools like email clients like Thunderbird or Outlook. So let's stop this and test out the resume functionality. So if we stop here and reopen and say resume and go to the folder we had selected, you'll see that it'll pop up with the correct amounts for the total items and the remaining items, so you can actually pick it back up from where it left off, which is good. So we have, like I said, the same type of functionality except for in-place searches. And of course, you have to factor in the limitations of the POP protocol. And another thing is, like I mentioned, POP doesn't have the flags, and it also doesn't have the server metadata that we're used to from IMAP or Gmail or Exchange in terms of the timestamps. So you're not going to get the same file system timestamp that you get when you collect with FEC normally. Let's take a look at, we don't have to let this run through, let's take a look at our output folder to see what the output looks like here. So same structure, we have the items in the multiple formats. You'll see that we have sequential number messages. Under logs, we have the acquisition logs. I have two sets here because I resumed again, so I have two different acquisition sessions going on. When you look at downloaded items, let me bring this into view here. You have a similar spreadsheet to what we see from our other acquisition types. We have the FEC IDs, we have the service IDs that are a little bit different with POP, longer compared to IMAP. We have the hashes, but we don't have the flags and the dates like you would see. Normally in an IMAP acquisition, we list the UIDs in sequential order and the internal dates, which is not present in an IMAP acquisition. On a positive note, when you look at the POP logs here, this is kind of similar to what we do for IMAP. So you see detailed logs of all activity with the server. So like a play-by-play of when we connected, how that authentication went, the server's responses, and all that stuff. So this is good for case documentation, obviously, so you can see exactly when you fetch the message, how the server responded, and all the details. So this is very similar to what we do for IMAP. So to wrap up the discussion on POP, like I said, it's there if you need it. Hopefully you don't need it. Try to avoid using it if possible because POP is very limited. But this is for those cases where there's no other option. Better to collect it with FEC and POP than use a general purpose email client. So now let's take a look briefly at batch acquisitions. This is something we introduced a couple versions back, but we have kind of refined it in the last version, and you should expect more improvements to come here. But I'm going to show you an example and some nuances in how you can set things up. So I'm going to set this up with an Exchange acquisition. Let's get my email address in here. And I'm going to use auth. You could use traditional credentials too if you wanted to. And I'll set this up for impersonation so that I impersonate other users. And in this case, I'm going to add some targets. And I'll add a single additional target here, which is this email address. You could add as many as you wanted, just to keep it simple and clear here. So I'll just add one additional target. I'll skip over this part. Let's pick an output folder. So when I authenticate, it's going to ask me, because it's all it'll ask for my username and password to be entered here. I'll put my password in. All right, so the one thing to note here is that my account here is kind of a special account in the sense that it has impersonation permissions set up in Exchange. So it is able to collect other end users' accounts. That's why when I added my users, I didn't need to add their usernames and passwords because I have authority to get all that without authenticating with their credentials. If you don't have that, then you can create a special user list that has those users' usernames and password, so you can override it. So in that case, you would not need to have a special user with delegate access or impersonation permissions. But in this case, I have it, so I won't authenticate as the separate end users, which saves some time and saves you from having to track down their credentials. So what happened here is I got my main mailboxes folder structure. Just to touch on a couple of things here, you see the recoverable items root here, which is the recoverable items folder in Exchange. So you see the deletions and some other special folders. And this whole structure here I have under archive root is the Exchange in-place archive. So good to keep in mind that you have access to those and you can check and uncheck them if necessary. And a quick trick if you wanted to check and uncheck some folders and their subfolders, you can use a shift click to check and uncheck a node and all its subnodes. So what I'm going to do here is, well, first let's talk about searching. So I could hit this button now to create my additional projects. In this case, I have only one, but I could have 50 or 100 or however many users we have. If I create the new projects right now, then those new projects are not going to have any search terms associated with them because I haven't run any searches. But I have the option to define an in-place search and then have it be pushed down to all my subsequent additional acquisitions. If I wanted to do that, then I'm going to run my search here. So let me do that, and let me launch this search box here and load some terms from Exchange. So I'm just loading a few very basic terms for Exchange from some names. Normally you would want to make these a little more specific with their email addresses or something like that. But for this, do. So I made a simple Exchange query just to narrow things down and show you that the query will be pushed down to the additional projects. So I'm going to save this. I see that the search query has been activated. So now I'm going to create my additional projects. In this case, only one has been created. So the important thing to know here is that because I created the additional projects after I activated the search query, now all those additional projects have the search associated with them. So when I run them, they will automatically be searched. And in my main mailbox, I'm going to just pick one of the folders to keep things quick. Note that because we don't know the folder structure of all the subsequent acquisition projects right now, we haven't even authenticated with them yet. When it comes to collecting the additional mailboxes, FEC will check all of the available mail folders automatically. So it'll search or it'll collect the entire mailbox, not just a specific folder from there. So I say next, but before I proceed with this, I want to show you the batch acquisition functionality here. So I'm going to stop here and I'm not going to collect. I'm going to pull up that folder where I created this. All right, so when you go look at this folder here, we see two acquisition projects. This is the main one that I created because I went to the wizard in Forensic Email Collector. And this is the additional one that got created because of that create additional projects button that I pressed. Now with the latest version of FEC, FEC also creates a batch file. Before we were letting users do that themselves, but I figured, why not create the batch file to make things a little bit easier. So if you open this up, you'll see that it's really very simple. It creates a batch file that points to the FEC executable. And as the first parameter, it puts the path to the FEC project that we created. And then it has this command line argument named start, which is what we use to start or resume a project. And finally, it has a command line argument that's called auto close. Auto close is a new argument that we introduced in the latest version of FEC. And what it does is if you specify that argument, then at the end of the acquisition, normally FEC stops and it'll pop up a message box saying, the acquisition went great and we collected everything, or we have a few items remaining, and it'll ask you to click OK before the acquisition is over. When you specify this auto close parameter here, that bypasses that message box at the end, and it automatically closes the software when the acquisition is done. So it starts, finishes, and closes itself. So the reason we thought about this was that some of our users wanted to automate in this manner, and the way FEC was designed originally didn't allow that. So when you have this additional parameter here, you'll see that you can kind of automate the process and let it collect one after the other. So if we were to just run this batch file now, it'll run the first acquisition. This is my main mailbox. It runs the search, collects from the archive folder. Now it's doing the second mailbox. Now it's, because we select all the folders in that second mailbox, now it's acquiring the snapshots for all the folders in that secondary mailbox, and it's running the searches, those search terms that we specified. Now let's take a look at what happens if something goes wrong and this dies. Normally you wouldn't want to close it just like that, but just to simulate a disaster, or you could say, some remaining items or anything that didn't go exactly as planned, you could rerun the batch file. It'll just gloss over the first one because it's done, and it'll resume the second one that we had started. So you see that it's only doing the last 13 or so folders that we had left, and it's going to run through them. And it found 33 items in total because of the search, because this mailbox normally has, I believe, over 1,000 items. And it's done, and because we specified the auto close parameter, it actually closed itself and finished, so there's nothing left. There are a couple of things here that you should know. One of them is these acquisition projects that we have here, although we ran them in an automated fashion with the batch file, they are still standalone projects. So you could open it up and see where things are. You could manually resume it if you needed to. In this case, we see that we have these 37 selected folders, and we have one folder without a snapshot. So that's kind of a serious issue that we would want to look at. So let's take a look to see what happened there, and look at the situation here. So in this case, we're missing a folder because one of the folders that was selected automatically was the audits folder, which is not accessible to email clients. So FEC couldn't get a snapshot of it. It didn't cause a error to stop the acquisition, but it just reports it in the exception report, which is fine. So there's nothing we need to do here. But this is to illustrate that when you run it in batch mode like that, currently you do want to go check out what happened in the acquisition logs. But there's one thing you can do that makes things a lot easier. If you recall, in FEC settings, there's an option to send notification emails. So you can turn this on, set up your settings for your email server, or you could choose this send directly option. In that case, FEC will act as an impromptu SMTP server, and it's going to send the emails directly from this computer where it's running. I talked about this before in the past. That's not usually preferable because this computer is not set up as an email server with all the reverse DNS and necessary things you do to get around spam protection. So emails could very well end up in spam. So I would recommend using a relay server like I do here now with Mailgun, or you could use SendGrid or some other providers. But if you don't want to deal with it, you can try the send directly option and see if it works for you. If it does, then you can just use that. But the gist of it is, once you set up notification emails like this, then when you run a batch acquisition like that from a batch file, then when your acquisitions are complete, at the end of each acquisition, FEC would send a notification email with the status of that mailbox. So that comes in pretty handy because what you could do is you could kick off an acquisition of, let's say, 50 mailboxes, set up your notification emails, and then as each one finishes, whenever that may be, you get an email saying, this mailbox finished, everything collected. This mailbox finished, but a few items remaining. So you get a tally of if there are any issues, if everything has been collected correctly. And if there's anything that you need to go back to, you could go back to it manually after the fact and look at it closely, look at the logs, open up the project and resume it if you wanted to, or export some metadata reports from there. Note that this is not the ultimate goal. For the time being, I think this works quite nicely, but we have some plans to make this even better and have a user interface to manage that. I've been calling this queue manager, so you should expect to see that coming up pretty soon. But for the time being, I think this is a good way to at least batch create the acquisition projects when you have a large enterprise collection, and then just execute them one after the other with a batch file. Here's another thing that you could do. FEC also supports running in parallel. So you could run multiple of those acquisitions side by side, depending on how powerful your computer is. So you could split things up that way as well. Just be mindful of throttling and using too many resources on the server. So this is what I have for the batch acquisitions. And as far as command line goes, you can look at the documentation we have here on our docs website. Command line support. So you see that this kind of outlines what I just talked about, but there's the path to the project to launch it. You can start and resume with this thing, and you can use autoclose to run it without user interaction. So you keep this in mind. And another article that you should check out if you run into throttling is this one. I think this is a pretty good summary of what is throttling, what happens on the server side, what can you do about it, what does FEC do about it. So I think, if you get into any large-scale email collection projects or large mailboxes, even, this is worth a read to get your wrap your head around, what could go wrong with throttling and what some of those error messages are and what you can do about it, now that I have this one. Now let's take a look at something else that we introduced a couple of versions back, and I want to talk about a couple of possibilities there, and that is running searches from a list of keywords and also getting search reports. So let's take a look at that. Let's take a look at a Gmail acquisition. So I'm going to put in my test account here. Let's leave this as it is. Skip over this. Authentication will pop up. I'll choose the login user. Okay, close. All right, so what I want to show you is, we touched on this briefly before, but I want to talk a little bit about some other options we have. So let's say that we want to run an in-place search on Gmail. One thing we had done in the past, in most of the webinars, was to type in our query here directly, which works nicely and fast, but then we introduced this search it preview interface that allows you to load the keywords from a file. So we touched on that in the last webinar. So I'm going to show you that and then some more. So let's load a list of terms here from file. So it pulls up, and I'm going to show you what that file looks like, just so you see what I'm loading. All right, so I have this flat file essentially, and each line of the file I put either a search term or a search expression. Either one works. It depends on where you're going with this. Most of the time you would want to have search expressions, I think, if you are looking to combine multiple criteria. But if it's as simple as searching for a certain sender or a subject or a term, then you can have single keywords. So when I load this up, as you see here, FEC will pull them up as individual lines, and it'll add an extra line here for the total hits, and you can execute it this way, and we had done this before. So the most common question that I get is around how to limit this for privileged terms and date restrictions. And this is, I think, two scenarios that come up most often in e-discovery scenarios where you run a search, but there's either some privileged search that needs to happen to pull out some results, for example, from specific senders or recipients, or the entire thing needs to be limited to a certain time period. So that's what this limiting expression here is for. And I'll show you a couple of options here. So one of the things that you can do is to put a date limit here. So let's say I want to limit this to before 2019 January 1st and after 2017 January 1st. So when I do that, you see that automatically all these search terms have been updated and that restriction has been ended with them. So you could execute a preview here to see how that changed things. So we are down to 130 total hits because of this new restriction. So here is how we would go about also restricting by recipients and senders. Let's say that I'm running a search with some limiting criteria like this. So I need to find documents within this time frame of January 1st, 2019 to 2017, January 1st. And then I want to exclude emails from the following addresses. If it's coming from this address, Dan at nowiknow.com, it's coming from this other address, or you could have a domain here like this. If it's coming from a specific domain, imagine that's the domain of a law firm or something that would make it potentially privileged. How do I effectively limit this to that time period and exclude those recipients? So for the first part, we already put the time restriction here. And for the second part, we would type something like not from the email address. So in this case, I'm saying not from Dan at nowiknow.com. And then if you have a second one, then you could put not from, in this case, the domain that we were trying to restrict was product hunt. It could be anything. And from is not the only term you could use. Of course, you could combine this with to, CC, BCC, whatever else you wanted to. But the key point is all the restrictions we have here are going one after the other. And if it's a negative restriction, then you put a not before it, like this. So if you run it now, we were at 130 hits before. With these new restrictions, we went down to 14. So that kind of narrowed things down. And again, we had mentioned this before too briefly, but if you look at how this is formed right now for the purposes of getting the individual counts per term, we are ending the limiting term with the positive term on each line. But when you convert this to a query, you'll see that if he actually does that only once, and that's in the beginning here, and there's a giant and here between our limiting term, and then the rest is just the positive terms there. So we can run a preview of this. We got the same result as expected, and then you can just save and proceed with the acquisition. So this is pretty common for applying a limiting term to restrict the search query this way. The same type of syntax and functionality also works for Exchange. IMAP is a little bit different. We don't have that search it preview for IMAP exactly. And something else that I didn't just do, but let's do that here as well. Let's go through this setup quickly. Pick a new folder. Something else that you can do is when you have your search here and you run it, once you run the search, you'll see that the execute button turned into an export report button. So you can click that and you can save it as let's see. Actually, let me make that folder. All right, so if I go check that out, I should see my search of report here. And the format of this, so in this case, this was a CSV, and we see the status is complete. But the format of the report is actually influenced by the preferences you have here, the report format. So this kind of carries into all the different reports that you have in FEC. So you could choose tab separated values, DAT for concordance style delimiters, or CSV. And that influences all your reports. So why am I telling you this? If your search terms have some interesting characters like quotes and commas that might throw off a CSV file, then you could export this in TSV format, for example, to work around it when you have a tab delimited report. And another thing that's important to know is this report format change can be done on a project after it's complete. So let's say you ran a project and you got CSV reports out of it, but you really wanted TSV reports, or you want TSV reports in addition to the other ones. You could go back and reopen that project, change your report format to TSV, and export in that format in addition to what you have already. So that's kind of neat that you can change that on the fly. And the last thing I want to talk about before we get into any questions you might have is Google Drive attachments. So I'm going to show you a couple of things here. So I'm going to temporarily switch over to a new version of FEC that we haven't released yet because I want to show you what we've been working on since we released support for Google Drive attachments. But before that, let's take a look at Drive real quick. So I'm going to log into Drive associated with this account. And you see that I have a few sample files here, nothing that's that interesting, but there's a zip, there's a spreadsheet, there's a Google document, and there's a PDF. These are a little bit different in their nature because the PDF is an external document, and so is the zip. So they're treated differently on Google Drive compared to the native Drive documents like the doc and the Sheets document, in the sense that their export is direct and Drive has hashes and sizes for them, whereas the other two are Drive documents and they need to be converted to either a Word document or an Excel spreadsheet or something like that to be able to be exported. But anyway, what I want to show you here is if you look at the spreadsheet, for instance, not only do we have the spreadsheet, but we also see that last edit was done 2 hours ago. Yeah, I just did that. And if you click on that and you see that there are different revisions to this. This is one of the powerful aspects of Google Drive or these online cloud storage systems, that they store the different revisions to the file. So we have the current version, and then we have some older revisions from June 21st. So when we got into acquiring Google Drive items, the first thing that came to mind was, okay, we acquire the Drive items, and when we do that, we get the latest version of, or the current version of the Google Drive file. But what about the revisions? If it had some revisions, and could we tackle that as well? Could we get the revisions of each file if needed? And the answer is yes. Apparently that is possible, and that's what we've been working on. So I'm going to show you how that will work, or at least for the time being, how it works. So I'm going to open up FEC 3.12 beta for now, and let's do a drive acquisition from the same account. So now when you go here, you probably noticed that we had this fetch drive attachments option for a while now, and now we have the additional option when you check it, fetch revisions of drive attachments. So there's kind of a big note here about what this is and a couple of interesting points, but most importantly, number one, a file might have a lot of revisions. You could have a Google Drive file that has hundreds of revisions, so potentially this could increase your acquisition time significantly. So that's kind of a big disclaimer there to watch out for. The other thing is the permissions needed to access the revisions of a file are different than the permissions you would need to read the file. So you might have some drive attachments that you can acquire, but you may not be able to get their revisions because you don't have authority to do that. For example, if this email address that I'm collecting now was the recipient of some files, then perhaps the owner was able to view those files, but they didn't have access to all the revisions of those files. Whereas if he was the sender of some of those files, so he was the creator in his own drive, then perhaps, well, not perhaps, then he would have access to those revisions. So that's something important to know, and you might see some exceptions because of it. If you see saying, permission denied or unable to access the revision, and that's the reason. So let's choose this option and skip over this part again and say next. One thing to note is because we chose the Google Drive acquisition options, there's an additional permission here that FEC is requiring to see and download Drive files. This hasn't changed because of revisions, so it's the same between the older version of FEC that just did the Google Drive attachments versus the new version that also does revisions. But this is kind of dynamic, so if you're doing a Drive acquisition and you don't request, so if you're doing a Gmail acquisition and you don't request the Drive attachments, then you're not going to see a request for this. So let's say OK. All right. So again, this is the same mailbox, and it has 900 some emails there. But to cut to the chase, I'm going to search it to isolate the items with Drive attachments. This could come in handy for you too if you are, for example, doing a supplemental acquisition. So let's say you already collected a mailbox and you didn't collect the Drive files, but you want to go back and supplement that with the emails that had Drive attachments. And you can isolate them with a quick query like this. Here's Drive. And then because I chose the fetch Drive attachment revisions option, you see that there are a couple of other statistics items here for the Drive attachment revisions. And let's get going. So because we ran a search, we're only collecting a few items here that had Drive attachments and revisions. So let's see how it goes. Now we're getting the Google Drive revisions for these files. All right, so everything downloaded. Let's go take a look at our output folder. Here is, so you'll probably recall that the Drive attachments stand alone for the time being, and they go into a folder called Drive attachments. And then underneath that folder, we have subfolders that match the ID of the parent email. So here is one. Tells me that this is the Drive attachment of this email 1. Likewise, 2 is the attachments for 2. So that's something you can use to match them up. And another thing that you can use is when you look at the downloaded Drive attachments log, the log also tells you the Drive attachments ID and the ID of the parent message. So in this case, it's a parent-child relationship. You can tell that this attachment belongs to this parent. There's more information here about hash, the type. For the ones that are standalone, they're hashes. The ones that are native files in Drive don't have hashes associated with them coming from Drive, and neither do they have sizes. And we have the dates captured from the Drive metadata. And then if you look here, so we have this Drive attachment, it's a zip file, and we have a revision of it. It's the same type of file. Let's look at this third one, which is kind of interesting. So this has two attachments, 1 and 2. One is a Word document with revisions. 2 is the Excel spreadsheet that we looked at. So let's look at the revisions from the oldest to the newest. So you'll see that we put the date of the revision here on the folder. So this is from June 21st, 2019, 7:04:32 UTC. So this is the spreadsheet as it looked at that time. Nothing. So this was probably when the spreadsheet was just created, but we hadn't really put anything into it yet. And you'll see that the creation and modification dates are captured in the file system metadata. Second revision, if you look here at the dates, is just a few seconds after the first. So this is seconds 32, this is 46. Here's the same spreadsheet, and we typed a few things into it. And finally, this is the last revision from today, earlier this morning. And here I had put a little text here saying some more edits on the 13th, and I added some more items on there to clarify. And if you look at the item that we downloaded without worrying about revisions, so the ultimate Drive attachment is the final version with today's edits. And if we go back to the logs, let's see what we have here for the downloaded Drive attachment revisions. So we have some information here. We have the ID of the Drive attachment revision. We have the ID of the parent message that goes with it. We have the ID of the parent Drive attachment that goes with this, and the service ID. The service ID for this one looks much different than the other ones because this is a standalone file that's like an external file, a zip file, whereas all the other ones, if you look at the MIME types, these are the native Google documents. So their service IDs for these revisions are just numeric, and that shows you the revision number. Likewise, the external file has a hash coming from Google Drive, and the other revisions don't have it. We have their file names. We have information about who last modified them, which could be helpful, and the email of the user that last modified them, and the last modification date, file size for the external file, no size for the Google native files, and that's, you can imagine, that's because this is not a file that really exists as a native file outside of Google Drive. It's a file that sits on Google servers until you export it. Google doesn't have the size or the hash of the final exported version. And here's another interesting thing. So for the external file, we don't have the export links populated because they're not provided by Google. But for the internal files, there's a column that says export links. On the spreadsheet, it's a little hard to discern, but if you look at this here, let me replace. All right, so this looks like this. So for this file that is a native Google Drive file, when we fetch its metadata, Google Drive provides us with the opportunity to export this in different formats. And here are the export links for those different formats. Oops, I do alert. So this may or may not be useful to you because we automatically, use one of these export formats and export it in that format. So for example, if it was a Word document, we would choose docx and export it as a Word document here. But this might be good to know. So if you have authorization to access that file, then you have the export links handy, and you could go grab a different version of that file if you needed to, or you could manually look into something. It's just that this information is available from Drive, so we just decided to include that in the logs that you get. Here's a question from one of the attendees here about when the Google Drive attachments and revisions feature update will be released. So the Google Drive attachments feature is already available and it's been released as of the last version, so you can already acquire Google Drive attachments. The revisions thing is new, and we're wrapping it up now. I would say you should expect a release for that in the next 2 weeks or so. We'll do some testing, and we have some other features and enhancements that we're making. So it'll be in the next major version, 3.12. I would give it at most 2 weeks to release. Yes, so those were the export links and the downloaded Drive attachment revisions. And you'll see that when the case calls for it, this is quite handy to have, because the alternative to this is to go play with Google Drive API yourself. And there are a lot of considerations there, and it does get tricky when you're trying to get the revisions. So it's good to be able to acquire them at the same time as their parent Drive attachments and export them together. All right, thanks everyone for joining, and enjoy the rest of your day. Feel free to get in touch if anything comes up or if I can help. Thank you.